I am Daniel Likis, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today, I have my special guest. Hello, Mr. Richard.
Hello, Daniel. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having you on my podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yep. So my name's Richard Ayre, and I've written a few books. I'm trying to think how many there are. About six, seven books, something like that, with Shadow of the Knife being the latest one. Um, I've written different types of books, really, different genres. So I started writing horror, and I wrote a trilogy of books called the Prophecy books, all about a musical demon called Minstrel and how he tries to take over the world, basically over these three books. And then I wrote I suppose you call it sci-fi, science fiction, called Point of Contact, all about mysterious deaths, people being burned to cinders, and an investigator trying to find out what happened to those people. And I've also written A Life Eternal, which was a little bit different to what I'd written before, which was the story of a soldier in World War I, who basically becomes immortal. And it's the story of his life told in the first person over the course of the 20th century, with him trying to find out why he can't die, what's changed about him. And then Shadow of the Knife is my latest novel, which is a historical crime thriller. So that's where we are now. That's where we've sort of
Talking about.
that brings me up to date.
Yes. So, you are a prolific writer.
Yeah, I've written a couple of anthologies as well. Just short stories, two books of short stories. The first one was called what was the first one called? A Hatful of Shadows, which was horror stories, horror and science fiction. And then I've written another anthology called Nightmares and Daydreams, which was a little bit more eclectic. There was some horror in there, but there were also some, not science fiction or horror, just sort of just short stories that I wanted to write. So yeah,
Mhm. So let's talk about Shadow of the Knife.
right.
What inspired you to write this book?
What inspired me to write it? I think. Well, it's funny. My publisher, who I wrote A Life Eternal for, got in touch with me and they said, "What? Look, what are you working on now?" And I said, "I had an idea of a story, another sort of speculative fiction type story." Um, but then I put them onto Point of Contact because I'd previously self-published Point of Contact, and they liked it and they decided to take it on. But they were saying that Point of Contact, there's a big part of Point of Contact which is very sort of police procedural type aspect in that, and they said, "Have you thought about writing a crime sort of thriller?" And I wasn't really interested in doing that, but I then got back in touch with them. They said, "Well, what?" And then I said, "What about a historical crime thriller?" Because I like historical fiction. I like reading historical fiction. I'm a history teacher. That's what I do for a living. So I'm interested in historical fiction, and that's really how it came about. And I wanted to write something about Victorian England because I've just got an interest in Victorian England, and
Hmm.
so I decided to write something set in that time period, but as a crime thriller.
Okay, that's very awesome, Mr. Richard. So, what did you learn when you're writing this book?
Oh, I learned loads. I was writing it. It was, it was during COVID, so a big chunk of this book I wrote while it was lockdown over here in the UK. Um, and so I did a lot of internet research, and so I was just researching various different aspects about Victorian life, because there's a big part of the book. It's set in 1890, which is 2 years after the Jack the Ripper killings. And there's the story is there is another killer, or is it the same killer, starting again. And so there's I had to, and I wanted to look into the lifestyle of these really poor people in the East End of London. And so I learned a lot about just how bad life really was in sort of industrial late 19th century England. That I learned a lot, actually.
Yes, that's true. So this book is all about history.
Yeah, it's set in 1890, so it's there has to be some historical accuracy there, but at the same time, I didn't want to be constrained by having everything totally accurate as it might be at the time. So,
Yes. So what does the title mean?
well, the shadow of the knife is the shadow of Jack the Ripper that's still haunting Victorian Whitechapel in 1890, 2 years after the last of the sort of canonical 5 women were murdered by Jack the Ripper. So, of course, the shadow of that stretches right the way across the book, because the main characters don't know whether it is Jack the Ripper returned or a new killer. And so, yeah, that it's the knife obviously is the murder weapon, and the shadow of the knife just is supposed to signify how that the idea or the fear of Jack the Ripper was still very strong in the East End, even 2 years after the last murder.
Okay, that's interesting. So if you have a given a chance to change the title of your book, do you have a second option to change it?
Well, when I was originally writing it, it was originally called Jigsaw. That was what it was going to be called, or that was my title for it. But after discussion with the publishers, we decided to change it. But Jigsaw, simply because of one of the main characters in the book, who is nicknamed. His name is he's a surgeon. He's a orthopedic surgeon who fixes broken bones, and he works in the East End of London, and so he gets the nickname Jigsaw Jarman, because he's called Carter Jarman. By the people of the East End have nicknamed him Jigsaw, because he patches bones back together. And so I thought Jigsaw was a good one, because it was a mystery thriller as well, when they're trying to find out who's killing these women and things. So I suppose if it was going to have another name, it would be Jigsaw, if anything.
Okay. So if you have these 5 adjectives that describe your book, what are they?
Wow. Well, historical obviously would be one of them, I think. Crime, thriller, fast-paced. Can I use that? And what would the last one be? Surprising.
Surprising. That's
Yeah.
cool. So how many days or months you wrote this book?
Actually, it didn't take me long. This book and the one I wrote before, Life Eternal, once I start writing properly, both of these books, the first drafts, it was only about 3 months for each one of them. Obviously, there was a lot of work to do after that, but when I'm I tend to take long periods of time off in between books, and certainly it's been very long this time after I've written A Shadow of a Knife. But if I'm writing, I try and do at least 1,000 words a day, after work, when I get in from work, and more at the weekends. But both of those were very fast for me. I think usually I'm talking about 5 months, maybe. That's the sort of average time period, I would say, for me to get the first drafts down. But
Okay.
it didn't take long at all to write the there was a lot of editing after that, and a lot of changing the story or parts of the story after that. But that was 3 months from start to finish, really.
Oh, that's interesting. Mr. Richard, do you think that Shadow of the Knife is your masterpiece?
I would like to say yes, but I don't. I've got to. I personally, and it's only just my personal opinion. I don't know if you asked anybody if you can find anybody who's read all of my books. But I would say the book I did before that, A Life Eternal. I think, to me personally, that was my best writing. So I would say my masterpiece up till now is probably A Life Eternal. That would be what I would say. But that's not to put down Shadow of the Knife. And a friend of mine who has read both actually said that he preferred Shadow of the Knife. So it is a very personal thing, as books are, you know.
There will be a sequel of your book.
Well, I have written about 4 chapters of a sequel to Shadow of the Knife. Yeah, which is set about 9 months after this novel.
Okay.
And it's again, it's the two main characters working together to try and solve well, in this case, it's to do with a kidnapped woman, and they have to solve mysteries to find out where she is before she is going to be killed. So it's much more. It's a condensed period of time that it's taking place in. It's probably only going to be over a couple of days, whereas Shadow of the Knife it was over a month or so. But this is a much. This will be a much condensed time period, if you like.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, can you give us one highlight of Shadow of the Knife?
Oh, what without actually giving anything away, because there is a surprising reveal to do with the killer and who the killer is. That's all I'm going to say.
Oh, sounds interesting.
Yeah.
So, people out there, please read Shadow of the Knife by
Yes, please
Mr.
do.
Richard. So, I have one more question. You're writing a lot of books. So, if you're writing a science fiction to thriller or any kind of books that you're writing,
Hmm.
what inspire you the most?
What inspires me? It changes. It changes. It depends, because I've written different types of books. I was what inspired me to write in the first place was James Herbert, the horror writer James Herbert. I'm a massive James Herbert fan, and
Oh,
it was the writing of James Herbert that sort of inspired me to write Minstrel's Bargain, which was the first of the horror trilogy books, the Prophecy trilogy books. I wanted, and people have said it's written in a similar way to James Herbert. I'm not saying I'm as good as James Herbert by any stretch of the imagination, but it's sort of written in a similar way. But I think as I've written more books, I've sort of got my own style. My own style has developed
yeah.
as the more I've written, which I think that probably does for any writer, anyone who writes more than sort of 2 or 3 books. I think you develop your own style. And I suppose my style is, I try to have a little bit of comedy in where I can, a little bit of humor. But I like to shock people as well. I like some things that happen that maybe you don't expect, and certainly with the first 3 horror books, they're very gory and very descriptive in the horror. Whereas that style of writing has changed as I've written. Certainly, A Life Eternal didn't have really any horror in it at all, apart from sort of the horror of the wars that the main character goes through. And Shadow of the Knife is quite descriptive of the bodies of the victims. But then again, if you see any of those old photographs or you read anything about the Jack the Ripper murders, they were very horrific. You know, so I don't think you can do justice to a thriller about a serial killer without some form of description of you know, what the aftermath of those killings are. So
Yes.
yeah.
As the author of Shadow of the Knife, if you rate your book 1 to 10, where is it?
11. We'll turn it up to 11, like
Definitely.
Spinal Chap.
Yes, definitely 11.
Yeah.
Richard, where do people buy your book?
Well, they can. It's Amazon is this. I would imagine is the place where most people will find my book. So you can buy it, you know, as an ebook or as a paper book through Amazon. But it's also available from the website of the publishers, which is Burning Chair Publishing. You can buy the paperback version there, but it's also available on the websites of Waterstones and WH Smith over here in the UK, Walmart. Yeah, really, anywhere you can buy a book, you can probably pick up a copy of Shadow of the Knife. Apart from sort of, you know,
So
big
it's worldwide.
stores. Yeah, it's worldwide. Yeah, definitely worldwide.
Okay, that's be great. Mr. Richard, if you want to have our second episode, we can do this again in your convenient time. Let's talk about all your books.
Oh, that would be lovely. Yeah.
Yes. And this podcast, I created this podcast to empower authors like you.
No, I really appreciate it. It's really nice to get invited on and talk about my books. I really do appreciate it.
And shout out for the people listening in United Kingdom.
Yeah.
In England, I have 84%. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Mhm.
Daniel.
Yes.
It's been lovely talking with you.
Yes. And it's Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much. People listening in UK. I promise you that I will invite lots of authors like Mr. Richard to talk about their books because people need to read books.
They do.
Thank you, Mr. Richard.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Lovely to speak with you.
More to come, people. See you soon.
Bye bye.